Hey there, friends. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I've got a story you're going to love. But before we settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these cozy tales. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see our little storytelling circle stretch across the globe. Now dim those lights, get comfy, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. In the beginning, there was light, before anything ever existed, before trees, or oceans, or stars. There was only God. No sky, no sound, not even time itself, just stillness, silence, and God's quiet presence. He didn't need anything, but he had something beautiful in his heart, an idea for a world full of light, love, and life. Then one day, or rather the very first day, God spoke. That's all it took. Just a few words whispered into the darkness. Let there be light, he said. And just like that, light burst forth into the empty space. A soft, warm glow stretched across everything, pushing away the darkness. The light danced and shimmered, as if it had been waiting forever to be born. God smiled at the light. It was good. He looked at the difference between light and dark and gave them names. The light would be called day, and the dark would be night. And just like that, the first day came to an end. On the second day, God turned his attention to the sky. He wanted to make something that stretched above the land, something to separate the waters below from the waters above. So he created the heavens, a wide, beautiful sky, soft and endless, like a blue blanket spread across the world. The sky shimmered in the sunlight, vast and open. Birds didn't yet fly through it, but it was already full of promise. The third day was even more amazing. God gathered the waters into one place, calling them seas. And where the waters parted, dry ground appeared. God called the dry ground land. Then he decided to decorate the earth with every kind of plant. Green grass gently covered the fields. Trees sprouted up with wide branches and strong roots. Colorful flowers bloomed, and vines began to curl up little hillsides. Fruit appeared on branches, juicy and ready to be tasted. Everything God made was alive and bursting with beauty. He looked at it all and said, "It is good." The world was slowly coming to life, and each day added something new. On the fourth day, God looked up at the sky and thought it needed something extra. So he created the sun to shine during the day and the moon to glow at night. But he didn't stop there. He scattered stars across the sky like diamonds tossed into velvet. Some twinkled gently, while others shone with steady light. The stars would help people know the seasons and mark time. The sun warmed the land and made shadows stretch, while the moon watched quietly over the night. It was peaceful, calming, perfect for dreaming. By the fifth day, the earth was full of land and sky, sun and stars, but it was still quiet. So God filled the oceans with creatures. Fish swam through the deep blue water, splashing and twirling. Tiny ones darted past coral reefs, while great big whales sang their deep songs. The seas bubbled with life. Then he looked to the skies again and filled them with birds. Some flapped gently, gliding through the clouds. Others chirped and soared high above the trees. The world was becoming more alive with every word God spoke. The wind carried the sound of birds singing, and the water danced with silver fish. On the sixth day, God turned his attention to the land. He created animals of all shapes and sizes. Elephants with long trunks walked slowly across grassy plains. Lions roared from deep caves. Squirrels darted through the trees, and deer leaped over hills. Rabbits wiggled their noses, and bears snored lazily under the shade of trees. Each animal had its own place and purpose. They didn't worry about anything. They just lived peacefully, happy, exactly as God intended. God watched them play and rest, and once again he said, "It is good." But God wasn't finished. He had saved his most special creation for last. He wanted to make someone in his own image, someone who could think, feel, and love, someone who could walk with him, talk with him, and care for the world he had made. So God formed a man from the dust of the ground. He shaped him gently, like a potter shaping clay. Then he breathed into the man's nostrils the breath, life. The man opened his eyes and became alive. His name was Adam. God smiled at him and placed him in a beautiful garden called Eden. It was full of green trees, colorful flowers, and soft rivers that flowed peacefully through the land. Birds sang from the branches, and the grass swayed in the breeze. Adam had everything he needed. But God saw that it wasn't good for Adam to be alone, so he caused Adam to fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. While Adam slept, God took one of his ribs and created a woman. Her name was Eve. When Adam woke up and saw her, he knew right away she was special. They were meant to be together. Adam and Eve lived in the garden with God. They walked with him in the cool of the day, talking and laughing under the shade of tall trees. There was no sadness, only peace. They didn't need to worry about what came next because they were safe in God's love. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the garden glowed with soft golden light. The trees cast long shadows, and the sky turned gentle shades of pink, purple, and blue. The air was calm. Adam and Eve would rest side by side, the stars twinkling above them like tiny candles in the night. They had been created by a loving God who saw them, knew them, and called them good. Every day was filled with beauty, wonder, and peace. On the seventh day God rested, not because he was tired, but because everything was finished. The world was whole. Creation was complete. He looked at all he had made, the sun and sky, the rivers and mountains, the fish and birds, the animals and people, and he said, "It is very good." The seventh day became a day of rest, a time to pause and enjoy the beauty of everything. God blessed this day, making it holy and peaceful. It was a time for stillness, reflection, and gratitude. And so the story of everything began with light, with love, and with the gentle voice of God calling life into existence. Even now, when the sun rises each morning or the stars shine at night, it's a little reminder of that very first week, a reminder that God made the world with care, beauty, and joy. And just like he watched over the very first sunrise, he watches over you too. Every night when you close your eyes, he is near. He whispers peace into your heart and wraps you in his love. The same voice that said, "Let there be light," still speaks today, and his light still shines. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of the garden, the star, and the gentle hum of creation coming to life. Know that the God who made the world is holding you gently, just like he held the very first day. You are part of his beautiful story. You were made with love, and you are good. Sleep peacefully, little one. God's light shines all around you. The Garden of Eden. After the world was made and filled with stars, oceans, and animals of every kind, God turned his attention to a special little corner of the earth, a place he would shape by hand, full of beauty, peace, and purpose. This place would be a gift, not just for the world, but for his most treasured creation, humankind. So God planted a garden, not just any garden, but the most wonderful one you can imagine. It was called Eden. Imagine a place where every tree sways gently in the wind, where the grass is soft under your feet, and the rivers flow like music through the land. That's Eden. It was full of color, light, and joy. The trees in Eden weren't ordinary trees. Some stretched high into the sky with leaves that shimmered like emeralds. Others were low and strong, offering their fruits without effort. Apples, pomegranates, fig, dates, fruit of every shape and sweetness hung on the branches, ripe and ready. Flowers bloomed in every color of the rainbow. Their petals opened to the sun, releasing soft perfumes that danced on the breeze. Birds sang above, their feathers flashing blues, reds, and golds. They chirped and fluttered through the trees, filling the air with cheerful sounds. The animals of Eden were gentle and calm. Lions rested side by side with lambs. Deer grazed near bear and butterflies landed on sleeping foxes. There was no danger, no fear. Everything lived in perfect harmony. And right in the middle of all this beauty, God placed Adam and Eve. They were the first human, handmade by God with care and love. Adam had already been created from the dust, and Eve from his side formed while he slept. Together they were perfect, designed to live in Eden and walk closely with God. God gave them a purpose. He said, "Take care of the garden." And so Adam and Eve did just that. They walked among the trees, caring for the plants and enjoying the animals. They had everything they needed: food, water, shelter, and most important, the loving presence of God. They didn't worry about clothes or hunger or cold. The garden gave them all they needed. They were free to explore, to laugh, to rest under the sun, or gaze up at the stars. Every morning the birds would wake them with their songs, and every evening God would walk with them as the sun set in gold and lavender. There were two special trees in the middle of the garden. One was called the tree of life. Its fruit could make you live forever. The other was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Its fruit looked beautiful, tempting even. But God gave Adam and Eve one very clear instruction. You may eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat from it, you will surely die. It wasn't a harsh rule. It was a loving boundary. Like a parent telling a child, "Don't touch the fire, it will hurt you." God gave them the freedom to choose. But he also gave them wisdom and a warning. For a long time, Adam and Eve lived in peace. They loved each other deeply and trusted God fully. There was no sad, no shame, no pain. Just joy, work that was satisfying, and a closeness to God that filled them with peace. They walked barefoot on warm earth, drank sweet water from clear streams, and tasted fruit that burst with flavor. The animals followed them around like curious friends. The sun kissed their skin, and the moon watched over their sleep. And every day they heard the voice of God in the wind, soft and loving. But something else also lived in Eden. Something cunning, something that didn't love the peace and joy that God had made. It came in the form of a serpent, slippery, smooth, and very clever. It watched Adam and Eve from the shadows, and it knew exactly which tree God had warned them about. One quiet afternoon, while Adam was somewhere else in the garden, Eve found herself near that very tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit did look beautiful. Its color was rich, and it hung low, almost inviting. The serpent slithered close and spoke to her. "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" it asked, pretending to be innocent. Eve shook her head gently. "We can eat from any tree except this one," she replied. "God said we must not eat it, or even touch it, or we will die." The serpent let out a slow hiss that almost sounded like a laugh. "You won't die," it whispered. "God just knows that if you eat it, your eyes will be open. You'll be like him, knowing good and evil." Eve looked at the fruit again. It did look good, and the idea of being wise, it pulled at her curiosity. She reached out and took the fruit in her hand. She took a bite, and then another. Nothing happened at first. The world didn't shake, and the sky didn't fall. So she called to Adam, who was nearby, and gave him some too. And he ate it as well. But the moment they finished, something changed. Their eyes were opened, just as the serpent had said. But it wasn't wonderful like they expected. It was heavy, confusing, and painful. They suddenly noticed they were naked. Not just physically, but emotionally. They felt exposed, ashamed, and afraid. It was the first time in history that shame entered the world, and it clung to them like cold fog. They quickly gathered leaves from fig trees and tried to cover themselves. They didn't want to be seen, not by each other, and especially not by God. That evening, as the familiar sound of God's footsteps echoed through the garden, Adam and Eve hid among the trees. It was something they had never done before. God knew where they were. but he called out anyway like a parent looking for a child. Adam, where are you? Adam stepped forward trembling. I heard you in the garden, he said quietly, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid. Who told you that you were naked? God asked gently. Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? Adam looked down. The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate it, he said. Then God turned to Eve. What have you done? He asked. Eve whispered. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. God's heart broke. He loved them deeply, but their choices had brought something new into the world, sin. A shadow now fell across the garden. The peace that once covered everything had been pierced. God looked at the serpent first and spoke words of judgment. You will crawl on your belly, he said, and there will always be war between you and the woman's children. One day one of her children will crush your head, though you will strike his heel. Then he turned to Adam and Eve. Life would now be harder. The ground would no longer grow food easily. Pain would become part of their journey, and they would have to leave Eden. But Eve, in the sadness, God's love remained. He didn't abandon them. Before they left, he made clothes for them, not leaves, but garments of skin. He covered their shame with care. He gave them what they needed to face the new world ahead. And so Adam and Eve walked out of the garden hand in hand. The gates of Eden closed behind them. A great angel stood guard, with a flaming sword, to keep the way to the tree of life protected. It was the end of paradise, but not the end of God's love. Not even close. God still walked with, even outside the garden. His heart was still for them. And he already had a plan, a way to one day bring them and all their children back to him. So as night fell and the stars blinked overhead, Adam and Eve looked at each other and knew that though everything had changed, God was still with them. And he always would be. Sleep peacefully tonight. The same God who planted Eden and walked with Adam and Eve now walks with you too. Even when we make mistakes, his love never leaves us. Rest in that truth. You are never alone, and tomorrow, like every new day, is a fresh start. Cain and Abel, the garden was behind them now. The gates of Eden were shut, and an angel with a flaming sword stood watch, guarding the way back. Adam and Eve had stepped into a new world, one that was wild, untamed, and full of thorns and hard soil. A world where they would work the land by the sweat of their brows and feel the ache of loss, of time, of distance. But they still had each other. And more than that, they still had God. He hadn't abandoned them when they fell. He had clothed them, comforted them, and watched over them as they began again. Time moved forward. The wind carried new seasons. The sky changed from pink dawns to velvet nights, and the earth grew beneath their feet. Then one day, a new sound filled their home. A cry. Their first child had been born. They named him Cain. It was a name filled with meaning. Eve said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." There was hope in her voice, a glimmer of something brighter than the pain of their past. Maybe this child would carry them forward. Maybe he was the beginning of healing. Cain grew strong. He ran through the fields and followed Adam around the garden's edge, learning how to till the land. His hands became skilled with tools, and he learned the ways of seeds and soil, sun and storm. Not long after Cain, another son was born, Abel. He was gentle, quieter. While Cain loved the heat of labor and the rose of harvest, Abel felt drawn to the fields beyond, where the sheep roamed freely. He learned to care for them, to walk among them, to understand their movements and sounds. He was a shepherd, patient and kind. The two brothers were different, yet they grew side by side. They shared meals, laughter, and long walks under the stars. Adam and Eve watched them with tired, loving eyes. Though the world was hard, it was not empty. There was still joy here. As they grew older, the time came when both brothers brought offerings to God. It was something they had learned from their parents, to honor God with the work of their hands, to give back a portion of the gifts they'd received. It was an act of love and devotion. Cain, the farmer, brought some of the crops he had grown. He gathered fruits and grains from the earth, placed them in a basket, and offered them to God. Abel, the shepherd, brought the best of his flock. He chose the firstborn of his sheep, strong and unblemished, and laid it before God as a sacrifice. God looked at both offerings. He saw Cain, but his heart was stirred by Abel's, not because it was meat and not grain, but because Abel gave with trust and humility. His gift came from a heart that loved, not just one that followed routine. But Cain noticed. He saw how God regarded Abel's offering with favor, and something dark and heavy began to rise inside him. Jealousy, a deep, biting kind, wrapped around his heart. It whispered lies and poured poison into his thoughts. Why Abel? Cain wondered. Why not me? What did he do that I did? I worked just as hard, maybe harder. God in his deep love saw the storm building in Cain's heart. He spoke to him, gently but firmly. Why are you angry? God asked. Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you don't do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. It was a warning filled with love, a reminder that Cain still had a choice. He didn't have to let that jealousy grow into something worse. But Cain didn't listen. The anger was loud, and it burned through every word God had spoken. Days passed. Cain's face grew hard, his eyes distant. Abel, unaware of the storm inside his brother, continued tending to his sheep, offering quiet smiles and kind words. Then one day Cain said to Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And Abel went. He trusted his brother, as he always had. He followed him into the open land, where the sun hung high, and the wind bent the grass. But something tragic happened there, something the earth had never seen before. Cain, overcome by rage, turned on his brother. He raised his hand and struck Abel down, one blow, then another, until the field, once filled with life and growth, became silent and stained. Abel lay still. The first human death had come, not from old age, not from sickness, but from a broken heart and jealous hand. Cain stood over him, trembling. His breath was ragged, his hands covered in blood. The wind that once danced now stood still. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then God spoke. "Cain, where is your brother?" Cain's voice was bitter, cold. "I don't know," he said. "Am I my brother's keeper?" But God already knew the truth. He always does. His voice was sorrowful, filled with pain. "What have you done?" He said. "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." God's heart was broken, not just for Abel but for Cain too. This wasn't how it was meant to be. The garden had been a place of, but now the earth itself had become a witness to death. So God gave Cain a consequence. "The ground that swallowed your brother's blood will no longer yield crops for you," he said. "You will wander the earth, restless and alone." Cain's heart cracked. The weight of what he had done was more than he could bear. "My punishment is more than I can take," he said. "You have driven me away from the land and from your presence. I will be a wanderer, and anyone who finds me will kill me." But even now, after everything, God showed mercy. He placed a mark on Cain, not to shame him, but to protect him. It was a sign that no one should harm him. A reminder that even in justice, God still gives grace. And so Cain went out from the presence of God. He left the place where he had grown up, where he had laughed and worked and shared childhood with Abel. He traveled east, into the land of Nod, a place of wandering and loneliness. Eve wept. Her heart, once so full of joy when she first held her son, now ached with a pain deeper than words. One son was gone forever, the other had lost himself to darkness. But life somehow kept moving. The world still turned, the rivers still flowed, and in time God gave them another child, a son named Seth. Through Seth's line, generations would come and go, some would wander, some would worship. But through it all, the whisper of Eden remained, a promise that God hadn't forgotten them. The story of Cain and Abel is one of heartbreak, yes, but it's also a story of warning, of choice, of how close sin can cut, and how deeply God still cares. It reminds us that even when we mess up, even when we fall, God's mercy is near. He doesn't turn his face away. He speaks, he warns, and he offers us a chance to choose differently. So as you lay down tonight, let your heart rest in this truth. God sees you. He knows the storms that rise inside you. He calls you by name gently and reminds you you are not alone in the struggle. And even in a world that has known pain and jealousy and loss, his grace still flows like a river. His love still reaches across fields, across time, across anything we've done. Sleep in peace, knowing that every choice you make can lead you closer to him. And no matter where you've been or what you've done, he's not finished with you yet. Noah and the great flood. The world had changed again. Time kept marching forward, and generations passed after Adam and Eve. Their children had children, and those children had more children, and soon the earth was filled with people. Villages rose beside rivers, families built homes, and the sound of life spread across the land like the wind. But something else was spreading too, something heavy and dark. People began to drift further and further from God. They forgot the stories their ancestors had told, the voice of God, the lessons from Cain and Abel. Instead, they chose their own ways. They fought, they stole, they lied. They filled their lives with selfishness and cruelty. God, who had breathed life into the very first man, now watched the world with a sorrow that words couldn't hold. The earth, once filled with beauty, had become twisted with violence. The people he loved were turning away from him again and again. And then something heartbreaking happened. The Bible says that God was grieved in his heart, that his heart was full of pain. He looked at everything he had made and saw how far it had fallen. God made a decision, a painful one. He would wipe the earth clean and begin again. Like a potter reshaping clay, he would wash away the evil and make room for something new. But even in his sadness, even in his decision to cleanse the earth, God noticed someone. One man stood out from the rest. His name was Noah. Noah was different. While the world turned its back on God, Noah stayed close to him. He walked faithfully with God, listening to his voice, trusting his ways. He wasn't perfect, but he was obedient. He had a heart that still reached for heaven, even when everyone else was walking away. God looked at Noah and saw hope, so he spoke to him. And when God spoke, it changes everything. Noah, God said, I have seen the evil on the earth, and I am going to send a great flood to wash it all away. But I want you to build an ark, a great boat, big enough to carry your family and two of every kind of animal, male and female, and I will make a covenant with you. You and your family will be safe. Now imagine hearing that. Imagine standing in a dry field, surrounded by blue skies, and being told to build a massive boat for a flood that hadn't even started. It must have sounded strange, impossible, even, but Noah didn't argue. He didn't laugh or roll his eyes. He simply believed. Noah started building. Day by day, board by board, he worked. He chopped trees, hammered nails, and shaped the ark just the way God described. The neighbors must have thought he was out of his mind. People probably pointed and laughed. Maybe they shouted insults or whispered behind his back. But Noah kept going, because when God tells you something, you listen, even when no one else understands, even when it takes years and years. The ark was enormous, as long as 1.5 football fields and as tall as a 4-story building. It had 3 decks, a roof, and a door on the side. Every detail was carefully followed, just as God instructed. And as Noah worked, something amazing began to happen. The animals came. 2 by 2, they arrived. Lions and lambs, elephants and eagles, ants and zebras. They came from every corner of the world. walking side by side, drawn by something beyond understanding. Noah and his sons guided them into the ark. They filled the stalls, lined the shelves with food, and made space for every living creature. It was noisy, yes, and probably a bit smelly too, but it was also incredible, a living parade of God's creation. Finally, when everything was ready, when the animals were safe and the supplies were stored, God spoke once more. Go into the ark, you and your family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. So Noah, his wife, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives all stepped inside, and then something deeply symbolic happened. God closed the door. Not Noah, not one of his sons, but God himself. He sealed them in with his own hand, a sign of his protection, his presence. And then came the rain. It started as a whisper, a soft tapping on the roof, but soon it turned into a roar. The skies opened, and the heavens poured down water like never before. Streams burst from the earth, and rivers overflowed. The land was swallowed, the valleys filled, and the hills disappeared beneath the waves. For 40 days and 40 nights it rained. The world outside the ark was unrecognizable, just water and sky, wave after wave, stretching endlessly in every direction. But inside the ark, there was peace. There were sounds of life, soft breathing, the rustle of hay, the quiet songs of birds. There was warmth and waiting. Noah and his family trusted. Even when they couldn't see land, even when the rain didn't stop, they trusted, because they knew God was with them. When the rain finally stopped, the ark floated in silence, just drifting over the deep. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, but eventually the ark came to rest on a mountain, Mount Ararat. Still, Noah didn't rush out. He waited for God's word. He sent out a raven, then a dove. The dove returned with nothing. He sent it again, and this time it came back with an olive leaf in its beak. Hope. The world was healing. At last God spoke again. Come out of the ark, you and your family, and all the animals with you. And so they stepped out, onto fresh ground under clear skies. The earth was new again, and the air felt like a promise. The first thing Noah did was build an altar. He didn't unpack first, or run. He worshipped. He gave thanks to God, the one who had guided them through the storm. And God was pleased. He placed a rainbow in the sky, arching across the heavens like a banner of peace. This is the sign of my covenant, God said. Never again will I destroy the earth with a flood. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. The rainbow shimmered in the sky, a silent promise to all generations, a reminder that even when the world falls apart, God's love remains. Noah's story isn't just about an ark, or animals, or a flood. It's about faith, about trusting God when it doesn't make sense, about obeying Him even when no one else does. It's about how God sees the faithful and rescues and restores. It's about how even when everything seems lost, there is still a future waiting on the other side. So as you drift off tonight, let the sound of rain in your mind remind you, not of fear but of cleansing. Let the image of the ark rock you gentle, safe and steady. Let the rainbow stretch across your dreams like a whisper of hope. Because the God who saved Noah is still watching over you, still guiding, still promising, still faithful. Sleep in peace, knowing that when the storms rise, you have a God who shelters. When the world shakes, you have a God who holds steady. And no matter how deep the water gets, His hand is always reaching for yours. The Tower of Babel, the world after the flood, was quiet for a while. The ground, once covered in endless water, slowly began to breathe again. Trees sprouted from the rich, soaked soil. Rivers found their paths through valleys, and birds circled the skies in wide arcs, chirping melodies of new beginnings. Noah and his family stepped into that silence with a sense of wonder and responsibility. Everything was fresh. Everything was possible. God had given them a second chance. And so the generations began again. Sons had sons, and those sons had daughters, and the great cycle of life resumed its rhythm. People spread across the land like seeds on the wind. But unlike the chaos before the flood, this time there was memory. Stories passed down around fires. The story of the ark, of the rain that never stopped, of the God who saved them. But time, as it always does, moved on, and with it the hearts of people began to shift again. There was a great plain called Shinar, wide and flat and fertile. Many people settled there, grateful for its resources and space. They built homes from baked bricks, strong and sturdy, and used tar to seal them against the rain. Life was comfortable, and with comfort, a certain kind of pride started to grow. At first it was small, a shared sense of achievement, maybe, a smile at a completed home or a field full of crops. But then came the whispers, quiet at first, almost playful. What if we didn't just survive, they said. What if we became great? It wasn't long before someone had the idea. Let's build a tower, they said. A tower so high it reaches the heavens. A tower that proves how powerful we are. A monument to ourselves so we'll never be forgotten. And the people loved the idea. It was bold, exciting, a challenge unlike anything they had ever done. They gathered together and began making plans. This wasn't just a simple structure. It was going to be enormous, the tallest thing ever built, with everyone speaking the same language and working side by side. The project moved fast. Brick by brick, layer by layer, the tower began to rise. It stretched above their homes, above the trees, catching the sun like a needle pointing toward heaven. But something strange was happening. As the tower grew taller, the people's hearts were growing heavier, not with humility or awe, but with arrogance. They weren't thinking about God anymore. They weren't remembering flood, or the promise, or the rainbow. They were thinking only of themselves. We will make a name for ourselves, they said. We will reach the sky. We won't need God to lift us. We'll do it on our own. And far above their tower, God was watching. He saw the bricks, the builders, the pride behind the progress. He saw how once again his creation was turning away from him, trying to replace him with their own strength. But this time, there was no flood. God had already promised never to do that again. Instead, he decided on a different kind of intervention, one that would touch not their buildings, but their voices. So one morning, just as the sun broke across the plains of Shinar, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A man shouted for more bricks, and the worker beside him stared blankly, not understanding. A woman called out for help, and her sister turned, confused, hearing only strange sounds. The same language that had unified them, that had powered their dreams and directed their hands, was suddenly broken. Not lost, but divided. One group spoke in a way no other could understand. Another answered in a completely different tongue. Voices clashed, directions were misunderstood, tempers flared. What had once been a well-oiled team, working in harmony, was now a scattered crowd of babble and frustration. The tower construction halted. The tools were dropped. Plans were forgotten. People wandered, looking for others they could understand. And just like that, the great project crumbled. Not because of rain or fire or war, but because of confusion. The people left the tower behind, its unfinished top reaching awkwardly toward the clouds. Groups began to migrate, finding others who shared their new language. They moved to different regions, different lands, carrying their own story, starting over once again. And that's how the nations were born. Not from pride but from the scattering. The tower was later called Babel, which means confusion, because it was there that God confused the language of the world. But as strange as it all sounds, there's something powerful in that story. It's not just about a tall building. It's not even about languages really. It's about the human heart, about how easy it is to trade dependence on God for independence from Him. about how quickly we forget the lessons of the past when we start believing in our own strength. God wasn't angry because they built something big. He was saddened they built it without him. They thought they didn't need God anymore, that they could build their own heaven. But real greatness doesn't come from height. It comes from humility. The people at Babel wanted to make a name for themselves, but God wants to give us his name. They wanted to reach heaven with their hands, but God wants to bring heaven to our hearts. So as the stars twinkle quietly above and the world winds down for the night, think about the tower that never finished. Think about the voices that changed and the plans that scattered. And remember that God isn't impressed by tall buildings or proud hearts. He's drawn to the quiet soul who whispers, "I need you." He loves when we build with him, not for ourselves. And in those simple acts of surrender, when we stop reaching and start listening, something beautiful rises. Not towers of stone, but lives rooted in love. So close your eyes now. Let the voices of Babel fade, and hear instead the gentle whisper of God. He's not far away. He's not behind clouds or on top of unreachable towers. He's right here, with you, always. Abraham's big journey. In the land of Ur, there was a man named Abram. He lived a quiet life, surrounded by his family, his cattle, and the familiar sights of his hometown. But as comfortable as his life was, there was a longing deep within him. Something more, something he couldn't quite name, called to him from beyond the horizon. Abram didn't know it at the time, but his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. It wasn't just his journey that was beginning. It was the journey of an entire nation, a legacy that would echo through the ages. And it all started with a voice. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert sky with streaks of orange and red, Abram heard a whisper. At first he thought it was just the wind, the usual desert breeze sweeping across the land. But as the voice grew clearer, more distinct, Abram realized that it was something much more than the wind. "Abram," the voice called. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. No one had ever called his name like this before. He looked around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, this time stronger, more certain. "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Abram stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. The voice, the promise, it was overwhelming. But something deep inside him stirred. Something told him this was not a dream, not a fleeting thought. This was real. He didn't know how or why, but he knew he had to obey. The voice had come from the God he had heard stories about, the one who created the heavens and the earth. It was a call he could not ignore. So Abram packed up his life as much as he could carry. He gathered his wife, Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the people who worked with him. Together, they gathered their belongings and set off, leaving behind the only life they had ever known. It wasn't easy to leave. They had family and friends in Ur, a city full of bustling streets, markets, and temples. But they followed God's call, trusting that he had land. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what awaited them. All they knew was that God had promised them a future that would be brighter than anything they had ever imagined. Their journey took them far and wide. They crossed vast deserts and climbed steep hills. They traveled along paths that had never been taken before. With every step, they moved closer to the land God had promised them. As they journeyed, God's promises began to unfold before them, little by little. They stopped at many places, sometimes setting up camp, sometimes building altars to honor God. Everywhere they went, they spoke of God's of his promise to make Abram the father of a great nation. But as much as the journey was filled with faith, it was also filled with doubt. Abram and Sarai were getting older, and they still had no children. They had left everything behind, only to find themselves in a strange land, with no sign yet of the promise being fulfilled. They were beginning to wonder if the dream they had been given would ever come true. One night, as they camped under the stars, Abram felt a deep ache in his heart. He looked up at the sky, the same sky that had witnessed his call, and he felt a heaviness settle over him. He turned to God, his heart full of questions. God, he asked, you promised me this land, this great future, but I don't have an heir. How can I be the father of a nation if I don't even have a son? God's answer came, not in words but in a vision. As Abram lay there staring up at the heavens, a voice spoke to him again. Look at the stars. God said, count them if you can. So shall your offspring be. Abram's heart lifted, though doubt still lingered. How could he possibly have so many children when he had none? But in that moment, he chose to believe God's promise, even though the evidence around him seemed impossible. Years passed, and still, Abram and Sarai waited. They moved from place to place, but the promise of children remained unfulfilled. Yet through it all, Abram continued to trust God, even when it didn't make sense. But then one day, God came to him again, in a way that Abram couldn't ignore. God promised that he would give Abram a son, through Sarai, though they were both well beyond the age of having children. At first Abram laughed, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. How could a man of his age, and a woman so advanced in years, have a child? But God wasn't asking for understanding, he was asking for faith. He told Abram that his name would no longer be just Abram, but Abraham, which meant father of many. And Sarai's name would change too to Sarai, which meant princess. God's promise became more than just a distant hope. It was now a declaration of reality, waiting to unfold. Though Abraham and Sarah were old, and though it seemed impossible, they held on to that promise. Then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, Sarah did become pregnant. After all those years of waiting, after all those doubts, she carried a child, and when the time came she gave birth to a son. They named him Isaac, which means laughter, because they had laughed at the idea that they could have a child so late in life. But their laughter wasn't one of doubt anymore. It was a laugh of joy, of disbelief, and of gratitude. Isaac was the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise. Through Isaac, the nation that would bear Abraham's name would grow, and through that nation, the entire world would one day be blessed. Abraham's journey wasn't just a physical one, but a journey of faith, and it didn't end with Isaac's birth. It was only the beginning. For now, Abraham had learned what it truly meant to trust God, to follow, without knowing where the path would lead, and to believe, even when everything around him seemed to contradict the promise. As you lay down to sleep tonight, think about Abraham. Think about the trust it took for him to leave everything behind, to walk into the unknown, to wait for years without seeing the fulfillment of the promise. And remember that just like Abraham, you're on a journey too. A journey with twists and turns, with moments of doubt and moments of faith. But the same God who walked with Abraham walks with you, and his promises are as sure as the stars in the sky. Close your eyes now, knowing that you too are part of a greater story. A story that's still unfolding. And just like Abraham, you're not walking alone. Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, had always known the story of his miraculous birth. He had grown up hearing how his parents had waited for years for him to come into their lives, and how God had kept his promise, even when it seemed impossible. As a boy, Isaac had witnessed firsthand the faith of his parents, the way they trusted in God's promises despite the challenges they faced. Now Isaac was a young man, and the time had come for him to find a wife. His father, Abraham, knew that it was time for Isaac to build a family of his own, to carry on the promise that God had made to their ancestors. But this wasn't going to be just any ordinary match. Abraham had a deep sense of responsibility when it came to Isaac's future, and he wanted to make sure that the woman Isaac married would be someone who shared their faith, someone who would walk alongside him in the journey that God had set before them. So, Abraham made an important decision. He called his trusted servant, Eliezer, to him and gave him a task that would be both difficult and significant. Go back to the land of my relatives, to the place I came from. Abraham said, find a wife for Isaac among my kin, someone who will understand our faith and our God, someone who will be a true companion for him. Eliezer was a faithful servant, someone who had been with Abraham for many years. He had witnessed the ups and downs of Abraham's life and had learned to trust in God's guidance. When Abraham gave him this mission, Eliezer didn't hesitate for a second. He understood how important it was, and he was determined to carry out the task with the utmost care. Before setting out on this journey, Eliezer prayed to God for help. He knew that finding the right woman for Isaac wasn't something he could do on his own. So he asked God to guide him, to show him the woman who was meant to be Isaac's wife. Lord, God of my master Abraham, Eliezer prayed, make this journey successful for me. Show me a sign when I come to the well. If a woman comes to draw water and offers to give me a drink, and then offers to water my camels too, let her be the one you have chosen for Isaac. Eliezer knew that this was a bold request. After all, it wasn't every day that a woman would offer to water camel, a task that was no small feat. But Eliezer trusted that God would answer his prayer and lead him to the right person. As he traveled to the land of Abraham's relative, Eliezer couldn't help but feel the weight of his mission. He had no idea who the woman would be or how long it would take to find her, but he trusted that God's plan was unfolding before him. When he arrived at the well outside the town of Nahor, Eliezer waited patiently, watching the women come to draw water. It was a busy time, and many women were there with their jars, talking and laughing as they went about their daily tasks. But Eliezer's eyes were focused on the task at hand, finding the woman who would be the answer to his prayer. Finally, as the sun began to set and the crowd thinned out, Eliezer saw a young woman walking toward the well. She had a graceful stride, and her eyes were bright with kindness. Eliezer's heart stirred as he watched her approach, and he wondered if this could be the one. As she drew water from the well, Eliezer took a deep breath and, with courage, approached her. Please, may I have a little water from your jar? He asked, hoping this would be the moment he had been praying for. Without hesitation, the young woman smiled and replied, drink, my lord. She quickly lowered her jar, offering him the water with grace and generosity. But she didn't stop there. After he had finished drinking, she turned to him and said, I will draw water for your camels too until they have had enough. Eliezer's heart skipped a beat. This was the very sign he had prayed for. He had asked God for a woman who would not only offer him a drink, but would go the extra mile and water his camels as well. And here she was, fulfilling that request in the most beautiful way. He watched in awe as the young woman without complaint began to water his camels, one by one. It was a task that could take a while, especially with 10 camels, each of whom could drink a lot of water. But the woman was diligent, never once showing any sign of impatience or frustration. Eliezer marveled at her kindness, and the way she carried herself with such a spirit of service. When the last camel had finished drinking, Eliezer knew that this was the woman God had chosen for Isaac. He approached her with gratitude and wonder, and introduced himself, telling her that he was the servant of Abraham. I am the daughter of Bethuel, the young woman replied, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. My name is Rebecca. Eliezer was overjoyed. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had found the one who was meant to be Isaac's wife, the woman who would continue the legacy of faith that had started with Abraham. He bowed his head in reverence and praised God for answering his prayer so perfectly. Rebecca invited Eliezer to come to her home and meet her family. She led him back to her house, where her brother Laban greeted them with warmth and hospitality. The family was eager to hear the story of Eliezer's journey and the way he had been led by God to their doorstep. As Eliezer explained everything that had happened, he shared how God had answered his prayer and brought him to Rebekah. He also told them about Isaac, the son of Abraham, and the great promise that had been made to Abraham and his descendants. Rebekah's family listened intently, and after hearing the story, they agreed that this was God's will. They saw the hand of God in everything, and they knew that Rebekah's future was bound to Isaac's, a future that was destined for greatness. The next morning, after a night of much discussion and prayer, Rebekah made the decision to go with Eliezer and marry Isaac. It was a big decision, but one she made with faith, knowing that this was part of God's plan for her life. As Rebekah traveled with Eliezer back to Isaac, she no doubt wondered what her new life would be like. She was leaving behind her family and everything she had known, but she was stepping into a future that was full of promise. And in her heart she carried the knowledge that God had guided her steps every step of the way. When Isaac saw Rebekah for the first time, he was overwhelmed with a sense of peace and joy. It was as though he had known her all his life, as though their hearts had been connected long before they met. And when Rebekah saw Isaac, she knew she had found the man she was meant to spend her life with. Isaac and Rebekah's marriage was a beautiful fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, and it was the beginning of a new chapter in God's plan for his people. Together they would build a family that would one day become the nation of Israel, a nation that would be a blessing to the world. As you rest your head tonight, think about Isaac and Rebekah. Their story reminds us that God is always guiding us, even when we can't see the whole picture. Sometimes he asks us to trust him and take a step of faith, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. But just like Isaac and Rebekah, we can trust that God's plan is always good and that he is with us every step of the way. Close your eyes now, knowing that God is leading you too. And just like Rebekah, your story is part of his greater story, one that is unfolding with each passing day. Jacob and Esau. Isaac, now a man of great faith, had lived a life full of God's promises and blessings. He had married Rebekah, and together they had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau, the firstborn, was a strong, rugged man who loved the outdoors and hunting. Jacob, on the other hand, was a quieter, more thoughtful boy, preferring to stay close to the tents and help his mother with household tasks. The 2 brothers couldn't have been more different, and yet they were bound together by the same promise that had been passed down from their grandfather Abraham to their father Isaac. From the beginning, it was clear that there was something special about these 2 boys. Esau, as the firstborn, had the birthright, the special position of honor and inheritance in the family. He was the one who would receive a double portion of his father's wealth, along with the spiritual blessing that came with it. But Jacob, despite being the younger of the 2, was ambitious and keenly aware of the importance of that birthright. He had always known that it was his destiny to be part of something bigger than himself, something that would change the course of history. One day, when the boys were older, Esau went out into the fields to hunt, hoping to bring home some fresh game for the family's meal. As the hours stretched on, Jacob stayed by the fire, tending to the stew that was simmering in a pot. The aroma of the stew filled the air, and it made Jacob's stomach growl with hunger. When Esau finally returned, tired and famished from the day's hunt, he saw the steaming pot of stew and felt his hunger intensify. Esau was so hungry that he could think of nothing else. He approached Jacob and said, "Let me have some of that red stew, for I am famished." Jacob, knowing this was a moment of opportunity, replied with a sly smile, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau, caught in the grip of his hunger, didn't pause to think about the gravity of Jacob's words. He was too focused on satisfying his immediate need, too tired to care about the birthright that had always been his. "What good is a birthright to me if I die of hunger?" he asked, dismissing the idea with a laugh. Jacob, sensing the moment was ripe, pressed on, "Swear to me first." Esau, not fully realizing the consequences of his actions, swore an oath, trading his birthright for a bowl of stew. In that moment, the inheritance that was meant for Esau was given to Jacob, not through any grand gesture or heroic act, but through a simple, impulsive decision. And so Jacob secured the birthright that would have belonged to his brother, all because Esau was too focused on the present to consider the future. As the years went, the 2 brothers grew even further apart. Esau continued to live his life as a skilled hunter, often going out into the wilderness to hunt, and bring back food for the family. Jacob, on the other hand, continued to be the quiet, calculating one, always watching and waiting for his chance to seize what he wanted. Their relationship was marked by tension, and the differences between them became more and more pronounced. It wasn't long before the time came for Isaac to pass on his blessings to his sons. Isaac, now an older man, knew his days were numbered. He called for Esau, his eldest son, and told him that he wanted to bless him before he passed away. He asked Esau to go out and hunt some wild game and prepare a meal for him, just as he liked, so that he could give him his blessing. Esau eagerly accepted the request, eager to receive his father's blessing, which he had always known would be his birthright. But Rebekah, overhearing the conversation, began to devise a plan of her own. She knew that Isaac intended to bless Esau, but she also knew that God had promised her that the older would serve the younger. She had heard God's words before the boys were born, and now she understood that Jacob, not Esau, was meant to receive the blessing. She called Jacob to her side and whispered her plan into his ear. Jacob was reluctant at first, unsure about deceiving his father. After all, Isaac was old and nearly blind, but he was still his father. And yet Jacob's desire for the blessing overwhelmed his hesitation. Rebekah quickly gathered the necessary ingredients and prepared a meal for Isaac, just the way he liked it. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes to make him smell like his brother, and she covered his hands and neck with goat skins to mimic the rough hair of Esau's body. Jacob, though nervous, agreed to go along with the plan, trusting that God's will would be done. When Jacob entered his father's tent, Isaac, who could no longer see, asked who was there. Jacob, pretending to be Esau, responded, "It is I, Esau, your firstborn." Isaac was suspicious at first, sensing something wasn't quite right, but Jacob's voice sounded just like Esau, and the smell of the clothes reassured him. He asked Jacob to come closer, and when he felt his hands and neck, he was convinced that it was truly Esau. So Isaac gave Jacob the blessing, unaware that it was his youngest son standing before him. He spoke words of prosperity, of leadership, and of power, not knowing that he was giving them to the wrong son. Jacob received the blessing, knowing that this was a moment he had been waiting for, but a part of him must have felt the weight of the deception. Soon after Jacob left his father's tent, Esau returned, eager to give Isaac the meal he had prepared for him. But when he entered, he was shocked to find that Isaac had already given the blessing to someone else. When Isaac realized what had happened, he trembled with fear, understanding that the blessing had been taken from Esau and given to Jacob. Esau, heartbroken and furious, pleaded with his father, "Bless me too, father," but Isaac could not take back the blessing he had already given. Esau, desperate, swore to get revenge on Jacob, promising that once Isaac passed away, he would kill his brother. Rebekah, hearing Esau's word, immediately sent Jacob away to her brother Laban's house, fearing for his life. And so Jacob left his home, the place where he had grown up, and began a journey that would take him far away. Jacob's story was just beginning, and though he had deceived his father and stolen the blessing that had once belonged to Esau, God's plan for him was far from finished. In the midst of his uncertainty and the consequences of his action, God would reveal himself to Jacob in ways that would change his life forever. This chapter in Jacob's life was full of mistakes, but it was also filled with God's grace as he continued to work in the lives of both Jacob and Esau, shaping their futures and fulfilling his promises. As you reflect on this chapter of Jacob and Esau, remember that God's plans are often different from our own. Sometimes we make mistakes, and we may even act out of our own desires or insecurities, but God is always working behind the scenes, turning our mistakes into something greater, just as Jacob's journey didn't end in deception, but in God's transformation. Our own journeys can be marked by redemption and growth. As you close your eyes and think of the story of Jacob and Esau, and know that even in the midst of our struggles and mistakes, God is always there, guiding us toward his perfect plan. The teachings of Jesus begin. After years of quiet preparation and reflection, Jesus began the journey that would shape the world for centuries to come. He didn't begin with a parade or a speech in a palace. He didn't gather armies or demand attention. Instead, he walked to the river Jordan, where a man named John was baptizing people. John the Baptist wasn't like everyone else. He wore clothes made of camel hair, ate locusts and wild honey, and lived in the wilderness. But his message was strong and clear. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. When Jesus came to him, something extraordinary happened. John recognized him at once. He hesitated. I need to be baptized by you, John said, and do you come to me? But Jesus gently replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. So John baptized Jesus. As soon as Jesus came out of the water, the sky opened. The Spirit of God descended like a dove and landed on him. A voice from heaven said, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. That moment marked the beginning of something beautiful. A journey that would reveal God's love in ways the world had never seen. Before he began preaching, Jesus went into the wilderness to fast and pray. For 40 days and 40 nights, he didn't eat. He was alone with God, reflecting on the mission ahead. But even in that solitude, he wasn't alone. The enemy, Satan, came to test him. He whispered temptation. If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. But Jesus answered, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Satan tried again. He took Jesus to the top of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. But Jesus stood firm. It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. One more time, Satan tried. He showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. All this I will give you, he said, if you bow down and worship me. Jesus didn't flinch. Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. And with that, Satan left. Angels came and attended to Jesus. The battle was won, not with swords but with truth and trust in God. Now ready to begin, Jesus went to Galilee. He wasn't looking for he was looking for people. Ordinary folks with open hearts. One day as he walked along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew. They were fishermen, casting their nets into the lake. Jesus said, come follow me and I will send you out to fish for people. They didn't hesitate. They dropped their nets and followed him. A little further down, Jesus saw two more brothers, James and John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. Jesus called them too. Immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. Jesus wasn't building an empire. He was gathering hearts. He chose people not for their wealth, status, or knowledge, but for their willingness to believe. Soon word began to spread. Crowds followed him from towns and villages. Some came out of curiosity. Others came with hope. The sick, the poor, the outcasts, all drawn to the gentle voice that spoke truth and peace. One day, when the crowds gathered on a hillside, Jesus sat down to teach. The moment was quiet, but electric. This was no ordinary speech. These words would echo across the ages. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he began, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The people listened, not because he shouted, but because his words reached their heart. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. He continued, painting a picture of a different kind of kingdom. A place where the humble are honored, the merciful are lifted, and those who hunger for what is right will be filled. He taught about love not just for family and friends, but for enemies. Love your enemies, he said, and pray for those who persecute you. It was radical, unheard of, and yet it felt so right. He told them not to worry about riches. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, he said, but store up treasures in heaven. He reminded them that their value didn't come from what they wore or owned, but from God's love. Look at the birds of the air, he said. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. He smiled gently. Are you not much more valuable than Jesus talked about forgiveness, kindness, generosity, and trust. He urged people to build their lives on solid ground, the truth of God's word. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, he said, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. People were amazed. He didn't speak like the teachers they knew. He spoke with authority, but also with deep compassion. After the sermon, Jesus didn't retreat to comfort. He walked among the people. He touched the untouchable. He healed the sick. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand. I am willing, he said. Be clean. And the man was healed. Jesus healed many. Blind eyes opened, the lame walked, and even the dead were brought back to life. But every miracle pointed to something deeper. It wasn't just about power, it was about love. God's more and more followed him. But Jesus never sought attention for himself. After teaching or healing, he would often slip away to quiet places to pray. Under the open sky, he would speak with his Father. Words of trust, words we may never know, but words that kept him grounded in his mission. As his teaching continued, the disciples learned not just from his words but from his example. He showed them how to love deeply, forgive freely, and serve humbly. Sometimes he would tell stories, parables, simple tales with deep meaning. A shepherd with a lost sheep, a father welcoming home a runaway son, a tiny mustard seed growing into a great tree. Each story peeled back a layer of heaven. Each one whispered, God loves you more than you know. As the chapter of Jesus' early teachings began to unfold, one thing was clear: this was not just a teacher. This was the heart of God walking among people. And though the road ahead would grow harder, Jesus walked it with steady feet and a soft voice. Because love doesn't shout, it shows. And in every word he spoke, love was the lesson.